Good evening and welcome. The First Unitarian Church of Dallas, in association with the Leadership Lambda Toastmasters, Club number 8631, welcomes you to tonight's first ever Dallas Unitarian Universalist Creative Talks. I'm not going to get any further before I thank two guys that are instrumental in helping us put on this program, and that's Michael Cheney up there running the audio board. Michael Tent's here with his wife and two sons, and he's also instrumental in running the audio board most Sunday mornings. The other guy is Fritz Kuehn. Fritz is the Director of Creative Development here at the church. He's running some cameras. He's a projectionist. He helped build our PowerPoint, and he's handling the recording of tonight's event as well. So if you were in a union town like Chicago, say, that would be a 5-man call. So really appreciate those two guys helping us out here tonight. I believe to knowing that any part of a group that you're a member of is a reflection of yourself. The fact that if it's like holding up a mirror there. If you want to get a quick check of how you're doing in your life, you can take a look at the people around you and see your reflection from them. I believe that sometimes when you're in that group, it's a fantastic thing. Like I'm a member of the Leadership Lambda Toastmasters. It's a fantastic group of people. We help each other to become better communicators and better leaders. And sometimes that reflection is not so good, like family members. I'm just kidding. I think if you shook my family tree, a lot of nuts would fall out. But I love every one of them. They're fantastic people. I think tonight, after you hear these 10 presentations from these wonderful people, you'll be very proud and very pleased with your reflection that you have here tonight. So thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it greatly. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Susybell Gosslee. Susybelle is a mother of 3 children, a grandmother of 6. She's an activist for human rights and the environment. She loves being with her family and friends. She loves gardening, sewing, and cooking. And here to present her talk entitled Changing Lives, Miss Susybell Gosslee.
In the early 90s, I heard about this conference. It was the Worldwide Anglican Encounter for Women Dealing with Justice and Peace. And when it had justice in there, I knew I had to go. I hadn't really heard a lot about justice in my church at that time. We didn't preach a lot about it, but I knew it was important. And I knew that since it is a worldwide conference on justice, I had to go. I found a friend, and off we went. It was an incredible conference of 800 people from all over the world, actually. Mostly women, but a few great men. And these women would tell their stories about everything that had happened in their countries and why they had come to this conference, why it was important for them to be there dealing with justice and peace. I heard stories about women from El Salvador, for example. And you know, we saw signs in Dallas, in the war in El Salvador, and I would just drive on, not really being fully aware at all of what was happening other than what was in the newspaper. So when I heard these women telling about the end of the war and the men coming back and telling the women that they had to get off of their tractors and they had to get out of the fields and go back to their houses to work, they were also told by their husbands that they needed to go into prostitution to help support the family because the men didn't want to do the work anymore and the tractors sat idle. I heard about women from South Africa and a lot of other countries in Africa. For example, one of the things that was important to me at that time was the ordination of women in the Episcopal Church, and I had been advocating for women to be ordained. And in this diocese, in the Episcopal Church, there was a real energized effort to block it. And I was one of those lone voices who stood up in support of women serving. Well, I heard about the women priests in Africa, how they would ride their bikes around and take care of all the people in their community. They would pick up one child or two. Before they knew it, they were taking care of 10 children or 12 children, even as many as 15. So the women were incredible examples of what women can do in the church. Every day there were different workshops and there were different experiences of sitting with people individually or being in discussion groups or hearing the different things that were going on around the world. But it wasn't like reading the paper. You know, we would end up hearing the personal stories of these people. Well, one day we had this hearing. It would be like this in this room, and everybody just comes for 3 hours, and anybody that wants to can come up and speak. Well, I had not really attended that type of thing, so I was kind of sitting in the back and hiding, honestly, and just seeing how this all worked, because I didn't really know how this was going to work. Well, we'd hear different people from the different countries speak. Now, actually, we had our earphones, and they were like the UN, so we would have translations in the 3 different main languages that were spoken there. And so you always could understand what was being said and hear the stories, and you saw their faces. It's not at all like reading in the newspaper. You'd see their tears. You would hear their voices trembled as their children were stolen. Or I heard stories of their children being stolen. And then maybe they would be returned with an organ missing. I had never heard these kinds of stories and was absolutely overwhelmed. So I would hear this from these different women, and I'm thinking, my gosh, this is horrible. Everybody ought to do something. Well, I was scared to death. I didn't really want to speak. You know, here as I'm saying, oh, everybody ought to do something, and then I don't even want to stand up and speak. So I saw this other woman, this from the Diocese of Dallas, the president of the women in the Diocese of Dallas, stood up, and she started talking about her abuse, and that she had been sexually abused by her grandfather from a young child, and she never spoke about it until her children, her girls, started being sexually abused by her grandfather. She ended up sitting down. We heard a few more speakers, and I thought, gosh, Susybelle, you founded a girls' home in Dallas just because you couldn't stand the abuse in Dallas. Get up and say something. So I did, and I told them about what it's like to be in the United States. I told them that 50% of the women in this country will experience violence sometimes in their life. I told them that 25% of the 18-year-old girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. I told them about the children that we served at our friend's place, the program that I founded, which provides therapeutic foster group homes for girls ages 10 to 18 who've been neglected, abused, and abandoned. So I had lots of stories, first-hand stories, to say what was happening in America. Well, my knees were not just trembling to where I could hardly stand up, but I kept on talking about exactly what was happening in our country and all the stories of the women who were raped and how little was done to help those women and what the system was and how there were barriers to these women to get the help they needed and even find the perpetrator. So I sat down. Several speakers went on. I could hardly breathe. I caught my breath slowly. And then this woman from Brazil stood up. She was a young woman, and she took that microphone and she said, "I'm glad to hear about the women in America. I thought the streets were paved with gold in America, but now I know that the situation is the same for women everywhere. I pray for the women in America because it's not until until there's justice for you that we will ever get it. When you come to our city and you visit and walk down our streets dressed nicely, doing what you want, saying what you want, expressing yourself, you're an example and you change our system. So now I pray for the women in America." I'm telling you this story because her story needs to be told. And all the other women in the world who have no voice, who can't tell their story, and if they do, they aren't believed. So I've learned to stand up. And I encourage you to stand up. I encourage you to do something wherever you are, because it's not until each of us does our own little thing that we create this critical mass, and it just changes the world into a whole new way of being. Thank you.